Hello.
Hello.
So I'm Quinn, and this is Raphael. And we're talking to you about computer security today in the context of a wider world. You might argue with whether or not computer security is simple, but I would assert compared to the world, it definitely is. So,
So yeah, I'm Raphael Vino and I work for Circle National Cert in Luxembourg.
and I'm Quinn Norton, and I'm from the internet. So, we're going to be telling a lot of sensitive stories today. Instead of actually giving you pictures or personal details of the people we're talking about, we're going to be giving you terrible, awkward screenshots of stock photography. We've preserved all the watermarking. I don't know that you can see it, but just know that the watermarking is there. I find that comforting. So, excuse me. So I want to take you back quite a few years now to the Arab Spring, and in particular, the Syrian Arab Spring, because it might not seem that way right now, but at the time it was very, very hopeful. And we didn't know how it was all going to go wrong. But one of our jobs at the time was supporting activists in not just Syria, but activists all over the Middle Eastern, North African world. And I don't know how many of you will remember this, but the big problem for Syrian activists at the time is they kept getting popped with Skype. They were getting attacked with malware over Skype. And security and NGO people, and especially NGO security people, like me, were very concerned. And we were harping on them endlessly not to use Skype. Skype was terrible. Skype was going to get them hurt. And the way it would work is that one activist would, in the network, would get popped in some way or another and end up sending a rat to another. And Dark Comet was an example. And these weren't super sophisticated tools. This was, I think, a student in France.
Yeah, like it was a teenager, a French teenager, who developed that and wanted to mostly to have fun.
Right.
Yeah.
But it starts getting used by the Syrian regime against these activists. And you might recall that there were a lot of news reports about this at the time. And essentially, we were all just harping endlessly, trying to get the Syrian activists to stop using Skype. I mean, it seemed like the obvious answer. So I went in 2013 to sit down with one of those Syrian activists who'd had to flee the country in Tunisia. And we became friends, and I had the Skype talk with her. So here's my stock image of an annoyed woman drinking a warm drink to give you some idea of how my Syrian activist friend took my cybersecurity advice. She explained to me they didn't understand what was happening. And basically she was saying, you don't understand my threat model. But she didn't use that phrase, but it was really clear at the time. She knew about the rats. It turned out Syrian activists were not idiots. But the modus operandi of the Syrian security forces was to go into people's houses and force them to interact, sometimes with other activists, at gunpoint. So when an activist was talking to another activist on this network, they needed to see the person they were talking to. They needed to see the environment that they were in. They needed to see if they were okay. They needed to see if the person looked happy or as happy as possible in the circumstances. Physical site confirmation was key to being able to trust the network of activists and dissidents. And I was still saying, look, when you use this, they can get all this information off your computer. And she was saying she understood that Skype was a terrible idea, but it was just the best they had. And here's what she told me. She told me they would switch to anything non-Skype in an instant that A, didn't cost any money, B, ran on Windows, in fact, often very old Windows, C, was easy for tired, frightened activists to use, potentially while on the run, and D, would reliably let you see the environment the person they were talking to was in. And really at that point, the only thing I could say was you should probably use Skype. That was a very humbling moment. The last thing she told me about all of this was that if she could turn back the clock, she would, even with Assad still in power. And I said, still not really getting it, that there's no way you could settle for Assad being in power. And she just looked at me tired, just very tired. Now in 2019, I can see that she was right. She was right about everything. I think about that a lot. I was the expert in the room, but she was really right about everything. I did go back to the activist supporting tech community and say, we need to build them a good end-to-end video call tool. And I wasn't the only one saying that. Now these tools do exist. They do largely what we want them to, but this is complicated and contextual and a real downer. Those activists were doing the rational and proper thing for the situation they were in. And all we could do was tell them to stop it.
So we have a bunch of principles that we really want you to go home with after this talk. And the first one is listen to your users. They know their environment better than you do. And as we've seen, like being able to talk to them and understand what they actually, in which context they're in, just helped us to figure out which kind of tools they actually need to actually work properly. And listening to your user means really shutting up, even if it's painful, especially when it's painful, and you know they're technically incorrect, and it's driving you crazy. It's really important to just have that in mind all the time when you interact with people you actually try to protect, because that's how you will understand what's going on. And if you don't exactly understand what's going on, you need to ask them questions, have them elaborate, and talk more about the context they're in, and let them ask questions and answer them when they ask, but never ever shut them down. Because when you shut them down, they just don't give you the information that you need to actually get your work done.
So fast forward from 2013 to 2016, Raphael and I were in New York giving security trainings to journalists, and this time, oddly enough, media company lawyers. We were gathered in a very nice conference room of a major New York journalism outlet with lawyers representing probably about 20 major American media companies. We were in this very, very nice conference room with little sandwiches for several hours telling them how their sites worked and basically what malware was. So while we were there to explain the internet to them, we had also decided we were there to scold them. See, these major media companies were having a bad problem. Their respectable and trustworthy institutions kept getting used to serve their readership's malware. And again, you might remember all these stories because it was one after another all over the world. And of course, this still happens. It just doesn't make the news as much anymore. So, you know, BBC reporting the Daily Mail. I think one of the things I found really funny about this coverage is that people tended to cover their rivals serving malware a lot. So BBC talking about Daily Mail, everyone talking about Drudge Report, Forbes reporting on Facebook, FireEye reporting on Forbes, Drudge Report again, and really in the end, just a ton of these very high status sites doing something very, very shady against their will. And this was incredibly frustrating for the people we were in the room with. This wasn't exactly news to these companies' lawyers. They had watched it happen. They didn't like it. They didn't even know where to start, though. So the audience kind of stopped us and essentially asked one person asked a very simple question that everybody else agreed with. How can we know what's on our site? And there's a moment where I think we both kind of fell silent because that really stopped us short. At any particular moment, how does a complex site, pulling from lots and lots of different vendors and resources around the internet, know exactly what's happening when somebody loads a page on their site? The truth is, their own site had become a black box to them. And these lawyers, obviously, given that they were the ones that had to respond when something went wrong like this, wanted to know what was on their site. And I realized, as we kind of looked back and forth, that we didn't have an answer. We'd never phrased the question that way. I don't think we ever would have asked the right question without a room full of lawyers dealing with being scolded about malware. And I just looked at the audience and said, we'll get back to you on that. So we went away and thought about that for a while. And what we did was we created a piece of software to do that. And it turns out to be a lot more complicated than we thought it would be at the time. So this is LookieLoo. LookieLoo takes a snapshot of a website and turns it into a phylogenetic map.
And to just give you like a bit of context, the tool is open source, so you can just like go look it up and use it on your own. But what it does is basically taking the URL, running it into a tool called Splash, that is basically WebKit instrumented, runs all the JavaScript, and returns an HTTP archive blob, and that blob is turned into a phylogenetic tree.
So just as a little background, if you don't know, a phylogenetic tree is like the map of life, so a map of biological systems, because I figured biological systems would be as complex as web pages, so it was a good way to represent them. It turns out sometimes web pages seem to almost be more complex. So on a simple level, a site might look like something like this. So you load one thing in, it does a redirect, it loads several other resources from different places. We've got these little icons that tell you what's being loaded in, a cookie set, a cookie read, JavaScript, so on and so forth. And then there's other websites. This is just a slice. If you could see the whole thing, it would go below the floor and above the ceiling. These incredibly complicated websites. But then it turns out that despite the fact that we made this for a bunch of media sites, that's not the only use it has. So this question actually of what's going on when you load a site turns out to be vitally important in the case of understanding what's happening during phishing attacks. And now it's a regular part of the toolkit for Circle and getting used as part of URL abuse. And I'll let you talk about that.
Yeah. So basically, what you can see here is a bunch of redirects going from like the URL I received in SMS to another URL to a third one, and then it's loading a page for like a phishing page for Spurkes, which is one of the main banks in Luxembourg.
And my bank, by the way.
But yeah, so and that's really, really useful to be able to see that easily and like do takedown requests efficiently. And that's what we use it now for doing takedown requests. And this website was gone within a few hours after we found it out.
Yeah, you're not stuck with the endpoint. You get to see all the things to take down in the intermediate points. Now, one of the reasons I'm telling you this story is because LookieLoo wasn't born because we are geniuses who anticipate the subtlety of the tools that will help us look at web-based malware in a new way. It was born because a room full of lawyers told us what they needed to know. They didn't tell us what tool they needed. They didn't tell us what data specifically they needed. They just said, this is the thing we need to know. And we said, okay, how do we solve your problem? And that question of how do we solve your problem turned out to also be how we solved our problems.
So that's the second principle we want you to go with, is that you need, if you don't listen to your user, you don't know how to do your job. You don't know what they actually need, so what you can potentially also use to solve your own problem down the line. And the second one is that you will need to take notes. When you are talking to the users, it might take a while. It might really take like hours. So if you don't take notes from the beginning, you will just like forget a bunch of stuff. So that's really like the really critical part to do when you work with them.
And when you're actually sitting down to talk to people who you are working with, who you are serving or something like that, I want you to think of you're putting on your anthropologist hat. You're studying the ways of the people around you to understand how their systems work, how their world works, and how you can actually help out with it. So two things when you take notes. One is then you have notes, that's great. And the other thing is you want to convey that you take what they're talking about very seriously. Being attentive, taking notes, being engaged, active listening, that's all part of this. Even, and frankly, the way humans learn, even if you never looked at your notes again, you'd remember more just from taking them. So no excuses. You can take them digitally or on paper, but you have to take notes.
And paper is often even easier than just pulling your laptop out and everything. Yeah. So the next use case we wanted to talk about is training. So I give trainings to company staff in Luxembourg fairly often. And one of the key things that I always need to do in those kind of trainings is to gain their trust. And generally, the first question I ask them is what's the most annoying thing they encounter at work when they're using their office devices. And generally, the first answer I get is that they are annoyed with websites being blocked. If that doesn't crack it immediately, I start also telling them how to bypass websites blocking and by just using Google Translate, and it just works great. But so after they tell me, oh, I get websites blocked, the next sentence is that they don't want to spend all day, every day browsing Facebook, but often enough, at some point, they need to finish some work from home. One man I spoke to had, for example, to leave the office early in order to pick a sick kid, and really needed to finish a report for the next morning at 9 a.m. And to finish that report, they really needed to get that Excel sheet with them so they could work from home. And that was a problem because they were not able to actually access any website to upload that on, and the company wasn't proposing anything. And that's a standard policy. I mean, it's like in all standard documents that even the default stance recommendation on like network policies has like blocking webmail-based emails and sharing websites and so on. But what's going to happen when you have someone really needed to actually finish something for tomorrow morning? They will find a way. And deal with the sick kids. They will just find a way around it. So that employee you really want to protect from the evil on the internet will find the shadiest website they can, the one you never heard before, because if you heard of it before, you would have blocked it, instead of just sending it on their Gmail account. And that's like 3 websites that I found by just like DuckDuckGoing yesterday. So there's a funny one, File Pizza, the one from the last decade, like looks a bit sketchy, but yeah, I mean, it's probably working, and the really fancy one. Actually, the least shady is probably File Pizza, because it's developed by a university.
Do we have any File Pizza users here? No?
Yeah.
Okay.
Did you hear of it before? One thing though, none of those sharing websites were like plain clear text. Like all use HTTPS everywhere, or at least some encryption, some HTTPS to reach them. So I guess let's
he was
encrypt it a bit
really
more.
disappointed that he couldn't find a file sharing site in clear text. Although I did remind him that it's probably clear text at the server.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably going to be stored somewhere in clear and no encryption at all. And even if you try to block all the websites and you are really responsive, that's like a bunch of templates to actually just create your own file sharing website. And those templates,
which you can leave plain old HTTP if you like.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm sure that by looking for it a bit longer, we will find like clear text, non-encrypted sharing websites that will be just used to store your really important confidential data. So keep in mind that you will never beat your users when they have to go pick up a sick kid at school and leave the office early and still write their quarterly report for the next morning. They will always find a way around their IT department and use whatever they could find. And the consequence of that is that you will end up 6 months later with a week-long investigation because a file containing all your customer data isn't VirusTotal. I mean, we all had that, right? We all had at some point some really confidential data end up on VirusTotal. I mean, you can just like search for a country and find all kind of weird things. And the guy who had to leave early and uploaded that file on that file sharing website will be really annoyed, probably even as or even more annoyed as you by the situation, because they had no idea that it could happen when they uploaded it or exfiltrated the data to that website. That's why it's really important to understand the people you're trying to protect. And if they need to work remotely, you need to give them a way to do so. Either by allowing a service in-house, like some file sharing thing they could just like use and access from home, or take a laptop home. But if you end up not having any of that, you're forcing them, even involuntarily, to use some random online service. Yeah. So what you need as IT department is figuring out what people needs from you, what people you're trying to protect needs from you, in order to let them do their work in a secure way. And one way you can do that is your work is not to judge. Your work is to help them. So they need to be included in the solution as much as understanding them. And if there is something getting in their way, some security measures are getting in their way, they need to understand why. They still need to be able to do their work. And in order to talk to them and interact and have their trust, it's a good idea to bring cookies. Just bring some cookies and it will get them to talk to you much more efficiently.
Cookies very useful in our experience of information security. Remember that they need to do their jobs as much as anyone else does. So getting to our third principle we want you to leave with, if you don't listen to your users, you won't understand their jobs. So you may have an idea in your head about how their daily day goes, or what they're trying to do, what gets in their way, but until you talk to them, that's just a mythological thing that lives in your head. So you need to kind of get out there and actually find out how things are working. So go see your users and talk to them face to face, really. Just have real conversations with them, like normal human talking things, and then ask them how everything is working for them. Ask them Raphael's question. What's the most annoying thing that happens to you in your day with your computers or your devices? And if you can't do that because they're not where you are, then use Skype. But see them and let them see you.
The next story I want to talk about now is when I started working with women's shelter in Luxembourg, and they handle cases of domestic abuse. And they are very often in really, really complicated situations. And the other one I want to talk about is a case where they had a family, women and their children, who had to flee domestic violence. So they were hosted in a safe house. And when they came to the safe house, the association took their phones because they were told that the perpetrator was knew where they were at any point in time. So it was probably coming from the phone at some point or the other. But when people wanted to get their phones back, even if they were still housed in the safe houses, the association wasn't sure it was a good idea. And that's what we learned. The partner was able to know basically where they were at all time, as long as they had their phone with them. It wasn't really clear how that was happening. At this point, he was out of the country, so they thought it was safe to use them again. And they really needed their phone because they had no money. They needed to be able to talk to their family and friends abroad. They need to be reachable from the work agency in order to be able to get a job. But it was always going to be somewhat dangerous. And that's where we start asking questions like, what is the partner doing? What made you think that they had access to, that the partner had access to their location? Does he own the contract of the phone lines, for example? Do you think he has access to the online media accounts? And the picture that came out of that was a person in a position of authority in other country, could have contact with the police, law enforcement, military in Luxembourg and or abroad, and may still have friends in Luxembourg, even if he was not in the country at this point. So getting the phone back at this point seems to be like probably not a good idea. And we need to find alternative solutions, such as securing media accounts, figuring out if they can use any mobile phone under their own name, for example. So at this point, it wasn't really clear what was going on, but we knew that we had to be careful.
Yeah, to say we didn't know that this person could have done all these things, but we didn't know that he couldn't have done any of them.
And there is no easy way out of the situation, because there will always be a risk. And we need to keep an eye on the situations long term.
Often with domestic abuse survivors, this kind of behavior can go on for more than a decade of just people being tracked and chased and chased and chased. So in this kind of thing, you have to think really long term.
And that's the kind of situation where the position is in such a position of power that it's really unlikely that any kind of litigation will do any good or improve anything, really. So at the end, we decided, it made sense for the association to have their own phones and loan them to families in these kind of situations, in order to just have them a way to reach out to their friends and family, and being able to still be connected with people they need to talk with.
I want to say a point before you go on real quick about this kind of a situation, because there's an instinct from a security point of view to say, just don't have a phone. But generally, domestic abuse survivors are in a situation where they've been disempowered for a long time, and trying to kind of reboot a life without a cell phone in almost 2020 is an almost impossible task, even more so when you've essentially been caged for usually many years by this point.
So, and that's the kind of work we are working with the association. So this graph is a work in progress. It's like far from being done, but the idea is to have a flowchart that will help them figure out in a roughly reliable way what's the best course of actions in situations like this. Because the main fear is that the perpetrator knows where they are at a specific time, for example, and having a malware on their phone is probably not the thing that will happen most of the time. Most of the time, it will be either something public that has been posted, or the perpetrator has access to the accounts. But that's important for the association to have those kind of flowcharts, so they can take good decisions based on the answers they get from the people they're working with. I'm working with them on the document. But it's really important to get them to write it in their own words, so they can then translate it in a language that works between them and the women they are taking care of. And in this case, the women and their kids have to live in uncertainty. But the better we understand the situation, the better we can make a plan that will meet their needs and hopefully keep them as safe as possible. Uncertainty is hard for us, for computer nerds. But that's how the rest of the world really work.
So the fourth principle we want you to take is you can't ever be sure. But the closer you work with your users, the more you can understand all the risks. And I think there's like a desire, again, we're all computer nerds, we like things to be mathematical and predictable. But when our systems hit the real world, we're going to have to live with a degree of uncertainty. And getting used to that idea, getting used to the idea that we can't fix it. Even if we do all the updates, even if we've got everything configured perfectly, ultimately we can approach something useful, but we can't fix it. So I want you to think about these stories in terms, and the stories that you get from the people you talk to, in terms of like a useful mythology. So a mythology is a set of useful explanations, and the ones that survive have some explanatory power. But they're useful explanations for conditions that are often out of someone's control. When a user tells you something is wrong with how their computer works, and they've told you what their computer is doing, and they're wrong, consider, instead of correcting them, how they may be right. Like the example when I was first working on the idea of user mythology, it was a long time ago in the history of computers, but one of the examples that I always used is that when you would talk to people, naive users or older users, about what was happening, there'd be a point where they'd say, oh, when I do this, the computer has to think about it. And at that particular time, every time I talked to somebody and they were like, oh, the computer's going to think for a while here, they were saying, this is a point in the program where my computer begins to swap. And the language was almost always the same. The computer's got to think about it. So that's like, it's a very simple case, but it's, I think, really good for showing how user language can actually be extremely rich. If you sit and consider, okay, computers don't have bad moods, so what's this person trying to tell me about the network connectivity or whatever at this point? Because if they've got something that they have found consistently to be true in their experience, they're probably describing a piece of information you need. So instead of saying, that's wrong, computers don't think, computers don't have emotions, silly human in the accounting department, think, how is this person right? How are they using the lyrical language of human experience to describe the dumbass Windows box on their desk? But also consider that these stories have persisted for good reasons and that they serve the people who tell them. And they're not necessarily that easy for you to get. So this also requires a lot of investment in time with your users. User stories have been so often rebuffed or ridiculed for not being factual and literal that most people, naive users of computers, have become hesitant to honestly and openly talk about how they perceive their machines and to relate to other people what they're doing and what their computers are doing back. So this is one, again, this goes back to our point about don't shut people down. When they say something crazy, just say more about that. So I want to say something about how you talk to people when you don't want to scare them about their computers, and they're already scared about their computers most of the time. Don't tell your user, and especially when you're trying to get them to change the behaviors, don't tell your user what to do. Tell them what it's doing. So if you're trying to tell them how to log into a system, don't say do this, then do this, then do this. You say, if you click here, the computer does this. When you do this, the computer will do this. And most people are not idiots. Most people are actually getting through their lives pretty okay, which means that if they know what it's doing, they will arrive at understanding what to do. So if you're working with someone, if you're trying to get people up to speed, try to arrive at the answer together. You're not there to impart, holy sacred text from on high. You're there to help them arrive at the answer together. And sometimes in that process, you'll find that the systems they have to go through don't make any sense. They've come to the wrong conclusions because the 5 things they have to do are truly terribly confusing and need to change. When they give you a metaphor for what's happening, try to extend that metaphor when you explain what's going on behind the scenes. Sometimes that you can gently extend that. Sometimes that can get really confusing. But if they're talking about their computer thinking, don't necessarily change that, saying, oh yeah, these are the processes that are very intensive for the computer, so this is where the computer will think a lot. Just wait, or we'll fix that, so on and so forth. Offer to go into technical details, but only if they want you to. Some people really will be comforted by the details of what's happening. Some people are just going to be totally shut down by that. Offer these things as gifts and not as things that you're forcing on them or withholding from them. When you finally get to the part where you're talking, because so much of this we've been like, you're listening. You're not saying anything other than being warm and welcoming to your users. Now that you're talking again, make that talking productive. So, one last story. In 2014, Raphael and I went to Ukraine to train journalists and activists. You might get a bit of a theme going there. We've done a lot of that. We stayed. We stayed at the Mezhihiria compound and Crazy Pants. It's a total Crazy Pants palace of the deposed dictator wannabe Yanukovych. We were splitting our time between there and the Euromaidan camp, and I just want to say it was an amazing experience. And we met and hopefully helped a lot of Ukrainian journalists and activists. I personally, when we went there, did not want to even deal with the crazy security situation we were probably going to be in the entire time we were there. So frankly, I just didn't. I took a vanilla, updated but completely vanilla Windows laptop with not much on it and didn't really log into much while I was there. Brought my materials, didn't do anything else, probably went on Twitter. I always go on Twitter, but that was it. I just saw the laptop as basically a sacrifice. Anyway, the laptop did get hacked. It was pretty obviously hacked. Somebody left something that we found.
Yeah, I don't really remember.
So we found this because I was like, I'm pretty sure this is bad. And he looked at it and was like, yeah, that looks pretty bad. But neither of us can remember what it was. We like sat around trying to talk about this for a little while, but we have no clear memory of how we knew the laptop was compromised. That's how much of an impression it made on us. This particular screenshotted stock photography isn't really to protect anyone's anonymity. This time it's just that literally neither of us can remember a thing about this. It was 2014, that's like 60 years in internet time. But also at this point, I wasn't going to throw a perfectly good laptop away. That would be silly. So I'd like to introduce you to my daughter. She's older, this is at the time. And my daughter's been raised to understand a lot of these issues. I went back to San Francisco, and I gave that laptop to my daughter. Here you can see her at the Stasi Museum in Berlin, making fun of the Stasi. I explained to her, I gave her this laptop, and I said, wait, it's probably been owned by either the Russian or Ukrainian government. Is that okay? And she nodded, and she opened it up going, they're about to learn a lot about My Little Pony. So don't scare your users, and don't let fear destroy your relationship with them. Especially don't scare your users when things are scary. Try to make this fun. So it's a good idea to not scare your users when the stakes are low. But when the stakes are high, it is absolutely vital that you not scare your users. People physiologically don't learn when they're afraid. They don't think clearly or make good decisions. And they can't communicate with you as well or hear what you're trying to say to them. Threat modeling is a thing that everyone does best when they're cool and calm and have had a good night's sleep and a healthy breakfast. And I think you know that for yourself. You probably know that when you're scared about something, you're not on top of your game. But then we get in front of people who don't know much about computers and yell at them to do things like not use Skype, or what you're gonna get killed if you use Skype, you know, whatever it was we were saying back then. And we expect that they're gonna suddenly be better at this when they're scared than we are. So my daughter in particular has grown up dancing in front of CCTVs and that kind of thing. She's very performative around surveillance. So I knew she'd understand what me giving this owned laptop to her would mean. And ultimately, what I really hope is that those hackers somewhere over in Eastern Europe learned that friendship is magic.
And that's the last point we want to give you, is that fear can undo everything you try to do to get your users in line with having good security practices. So it can undo absolutely everything that is on that list. So just don't do that, and listen to them, give them good advices, good ideas, and it's going to be a lot better. It's going to make your life and your work a lot easier on the long term.
Remember, fear is the mind killer. So I think we're pretty much wrapped up. We're going to go ahead and leave this up here in hopes that we can get it to sink in ever more deeper the longer we leave it on the wall. But I think we've got time for some questions.
Is there any?
Not all at once.
Okay.
I mean, I can also go on endlessly about the people I've talked to. Yeah, I will go ahead and say one more thing. It really, people in all sorts of situations, corporate, kinetic, so on and so forth, they really have continually surprised me. I've never had the same job twice when it comes to training, helping, being the expert in the room, dealing with people who are doing, who are needing to worry about their information security. I've had to go back and research mosaic theory for Iranian activists because their threat model was somebody putting together a lot of disparate pieces of information and understanding the context of people who are trying to not be caught. I've talked to people who said, I can't secure anything, it makes me look suspicious. I've talked to other people who are like, wait, if somebody starts using encryption, everybody's going to, that's going to stand out. What happens to me then? And I had to say, yeah, you're right. We're all telling you to use encrypted communication, but the first one that does in a monitored community better have nothing incriminating in their house. And a lot of this is different tech from different time periods. But until you have created this rapport with the people that you're trying to protect, they're not going to be in a position to give you the information you need. Oh, come on. Actually, here's another way of trying to get you guys talking. Do you guys have any interesting user stories you'd want to share with the room? Any interesting examples of places where listening or just the crazy pants situation was something that you learned from? I swear I'm going to call on someone pretty soon.
If you don't, you can always come to us also after the talk.
Yeah, that's true. If you want to do this one-on-one, and you don't have screen caps of awkward stock photography to protect people, we'll be around. You can come chat with us.
And yeah, if you want to reach us, that's our emails and Twitter handles and so on.
We're not on Skype.
Yeah.